Thank you all for being here on this blustery November evening. I'm going to do a brief land acknowledgement and then read the bio of Leslie and then let her take us through a very beautiful and informative presentation. So Lopez Island is part of the ancestral homelands and waterways of the Samish, Lummi, Saanich, Semiahmoo, Suk, Songhees, Sklallam, Swinomish, Skagit, Stillaguamish, and others. They have been here since time immemorial, and they are still here. These islands and waterways remain significant to Coast Salish peoples who continue to hold cultural ties and exercise treaty rights to resources here today. We, the Lopez Island Historical Society, acknowledge that we are not the authority on this history and that our understanding of history itself is shaped by our own biases and limitations based on our identities. As we continue to learn and work with local tribes, bands, and individuals, we are committed to creating space for and supporting Coast Salish peoples and voices through our program series and our exhibit space. The proceeds of this evening's program are going to go to the Coast Salish Youth Stewardship Corps, a program of the Madrona Institute. So if you haven't donated or you feel like you can donate a little bit more freely, knowing it's going to go to such a wonderful organization, please do. We have jars at the front with Valerie. Leslie Eastwood, Samish, carries the ancestral name Halperin and weaves on a traditional upright Coast Salish loom with a focus on regalia for ceremonial purposes. She apprenticed with Rita Lewis, Samish, Paquichan, whose woven blankets have been presented to dignitaries of the British royal family. Recently, Leslie has retired as general manager of Samish Indian Nation and provides demonstrations to raise public awareness and leads wool weaving workshops to promote wool regalia within the Samish community. Please join me in welcoming Leslie Eastwood.
Saistinasalis, Zitsino Hili Quinzana Tachel Atia Tangan, Halitaliga Sanasna Ch Saamish, Ch Saamish. I'm raising my hands to you. I'm raising my hands to you. I'm truly happy to be gathered with you here on this evening. And my ancestral name is Halitaliga. I come from Samish. I come from Samish. And I'm greeting you in a traditional way. I'm greeting you in a traditional way. And I want to also acknowledge all of you good people, you Chalacha, good friends, who came out on this blustery night to be a part of this conversation. But I want you to look around the room, and if you see an empty chair, I want you to recognize along with me that we're not alone. We've got ancestors here who are happy that this information is going to be shared. And so what I'm sharing with you tonight comes from a lot of different places. It comes from what's been told to me. It comes from what I've observed, and it comes from books. Because we know our people had a period of dormancy after colonization. That's going to be woven into my talk here tonight. And part of what my Samish community and many other tribal communities here have been doing, and we're so excited to be doing, is rebirthing and remembering and revitalizing the old ways of doing things. So I'm really happy to be talking to you about three primary things here tonight. How were things historically, to the greatest extent possible, if we can go back and think about what things might have been like pre-contact, and then what was that influence of colonization, and then what are we doing now to raise the vibrancy of those memories and also our creativity as weavers, as people who work with the fiber of life. So the title is Nobility Blankets, Coast Salish Women's Role in an Economy of Generosity. So there's layers of meaning there, and I'm excited to walk down a road with you exploring that. And I'm going to also out myself that I freely grabbed things that I saw on the internet that I thought would be exciting for you to see here tonight. So in 2018, there was a beautiful exhibit that was held up at the University of British Columbia in the Lower Mainland. It was called The Fabric of Our Land. And it brought together contemporary weavers and historic blankets. They brought blankets out of the archives. They brought blankets that had been stored in museums in Finland, that had been, bartered, traded, whatever, with some of the tall ships that came through this area, and they ended up in collections in Europe. So one of the proudest things for me is that I'm raising a 14-year-old. A lot of you know Rosie Caillou. She's Rosie's granddaughter, Jaylee. Jaylee's other great-grandma on her mom's side of the family is Barb Marks McCoy, and Barb was part of the Musqueam Weavers. And part of her journey when she was immersing herself in Coast Salish blanket weaving, she took it upon herself to recreate entirely stitch for stitch one of those blankets that were in a museum in Europe. And so in 2018, she was able to come full circle back and have that blanket and her blanket side by side. So that was really a powerful experience for all of our weavers in this area in terms of re-energizing the excitement around that. So I'm sharing this story with you because this map up here flips on its side how we think about our Coast Salish Sea. This isn't just some random sea. That is actually the southern point of Vancouver Island, and it's our San Juan Islands stretching out next to it, and north is going that way, horizontally instead of vertically. And it's giving you a glimpse from another vantage point of what this area looks like and how closely related we are. So all of those bright green areas are the places where people could live and where villages were, and how our people traded and lived and flowed back and forth with one another. And so once again, our creation stories place us here without anything like a land bridge. We talk about how we came from the stars to this place, that we've always been here, and other science backs us up about that. Our teachings since time immemorial are about how you become a good human being. And they emphasize generosity and industrious. They go hand in hand. That industrious is always about food gathering, building things, making things. But those things and the food stores, they're only valuable to the extent that you're sharing, that you're gifting them away. So that generosity and that industrious, they go together. A lazy person is as bad as a greedy person in our culture. They're both looked down upon. And so having people be always busy, always doing something, always working with your hands, or always thinking about that next hunt, or you're fishing, taking care of your nets, all of those things are really important. And it upholds our status, and it cements the relationships of reciprocal back and forth, that exchange amongst us. So that really matters. As we dive deeper, let's talk about how our culture was shaped. It was like an inverted pear. And so you had a large body of people that were considered high class. And how they were considered high class was they knew their lineage. They had that inherent knowledge that they took care of. They didn't forget who they were and what their teachings were. They had privileges of ritual practices that were passed down, and they carried that on. They didn't forget that. They were good at fishing or carving, or they were an impressive gambler, which you see casinos, and it's not an accident that how tribal economies are, this day and age is very linked to gambling, because Slahal was a gift from the Creator that helped us settle conflicts, and so gambling was a part of our fiber of our culture as well. And the amassing of wealth was only for the purpose of exchange. It was only for the purpose of exchange. You were also considered a high-class person if you had spiritual prowess and strength. So those were the things that defined and the characteristics of people that held themselves to be upstanding. You had a smaller number of lower class people, and these were the people that were lazy or greedy or didn't take care of their knowledge. They didn't pass that down. They failed to live up to those responsibilities of the other things. And in our society, it was a very small number of people that fell into that state of being looked down upon by the people who know how to take care of themselves and how to take care of one another. It was something that our people did not openly criticize, but you knew what a raised eyebrow from an auntie was. And those raised eyebrows often did a lot about keeping kids in line. And there were, to be honest, in our area, a very small number of people that were considered to have the status of slaves, and they were owned and supported, lived with the upper class households, but they were very much indentured in a way. I guess it would be indebted. They had fallen upon situations either by being captive through some kind of altercation with another community, or they had fallen upon very hard times and had no other way of sustaining them than to prey upon the good graces of somebody that was more well-to-do than them. And so these classes were not impermeable. People could move from one status to another. It wasn't terribly common, but again, the way that you would move upward was by lifting yourself up and by following those characteristics of an upstanding person, and you could fall down the same way. So moving on, we have this value system. So what was so important amongst the fabric of all of our communities was a network of intermarriages. And we had a rule that you couldn't marry somebody who was closer than fifth cousin. So stop and think about, do you even know who your fifth cousins are? Like, can you do the math in your head to try and work that out and think about if you know them or not? That's how guarded people were about their genealogy and making sure that you had fresh blood coming in and out of these villages. So people from Samish would be looking for marriage mates for their promising young people over in Clallam, or up at Lummi, or over in Saanich, or maybe even Songhees. A really high-class family might go as far as Skokomish to find somebody who was marriageable. And again, what that did, those relationships between in-laws were some of the most important relationships that existed, almost closer than the blood ties, because that meant you could go far away to another village, and if they were your in-laws, you had the ability to come ashore and bring them food. That was always what you did when you went to visit your in-laws. You'd bring them food. And in return, they would give you blankets. And it wasn't a payment. It was an exchange. It was a thank you. It was an acknowledgement. And so people often say that blankets were used as currency, and that diminishes the value, really, of what blankets meant in our culture, because currency doesn't get wrapped around a person. Currency doesn't lay on the floor and then you're stood upon when you take your Indian name or things like that. So the blankets actually served a purpose, and they were a part of how you demonstrated connection and relationship with one another. And in all of our potlatch ceremonies, whether it was a memorial, whether it was a naming ceremony, whether it was some kind of a funeral ceremony, whether it was the weddings we've already talked about, celebrating births, so many different kinds of events were celebrated. A well-to-do household head, if there was so much wealth that they had amassed, they would have a potlatch just for the purpose of sharing, inviting all of the neighbors and bringing people here, and everything would be given away, and they'd start over again. And it was that ongoing cycle in which blankets played a critical role that our Coast Salish communities were, I guess, woven together is better than knit together. So let's talk about, where did all the wool come from? Well, not the most wool, but the most important wool was from Buckalkan, which is the mountain goat, Buckalkan in our Coast Straight Salish dialogue. And the mountain goats were considered the most prized, the most pure, the most spiritual of all the mammals, because where do they live? On top of the mountains. They live closest to the Creator. And the whiteness of their wool was also something that set them apart from any of the other mammals around here. And so Samish, who lived primarily out here in the islands pre-contact, we relied on our family ties mostly with folks from Upper Skagit for our mountain goat wool, through either exchanges with our in-laws and or permission to hunt in that territory. So that whether we were culturally exchanging or whether we were hunting there, it was whole pelts that came back to our territory, and then the women would process that whole pelt, and they'd be removing the guard hairs, they'd be separating the downy parts from the longer fibers for spinning, and they would be pounding it with diatomaceous clay. So that's a special type of white clay that can be pounded, and we had beater sticks that would beat into it and remove any of the droppings that might have clung to it, or dirt and mud and things like that, and it would become very clean after that processing. So those mountain goat blankets were considered the most sacred, the most noble, and a smaller number of them were reserved for very sacred work. And then some blankets included mountain goat wool plus the wool of woolly dogs. And so Coast Salish woolly dogs were owned and kept by high-class women. So again, that large high-class structure, a well-to-do woman might own 20 to 30 dogs herself. And they were kept separately from rangy little short-haired dogs that the men used for going out and hunting deer with. They'd use the dog to drive deer and or ducks into nets and then snare them as part of their hunting mechanisms. But the woolly dogs were actually sort of a medium-sized dog. You can see Mary Adams in the upper right for you all. She's seated with her dog Jumbo, who's considered to be possibly one of the last of his type. We don't know the name of the other dog on the lower left, but that's from the East Sanish village of Sayot. And then up in the center is the pelt of a very famous Coast Salish woolly dog called Mutton. Mutton had belonged to George Gibbs, who was coming through as an explorer, and he was with C.B. Kennerly, who was doing a bunch of research for a museum back east called the Smithsonian. And Kennerly had a wonderful mountain goat pelt, head and all, that he was enamored with, and Mutton got a hold of it and destroyed the head. Kennerly was furious because it damaged the specimen he was going to be sending back to the museum, and at the time of the offense, Mutton was short hair, and so between he and George Gibbs, they decided that Mutton could grow his hair out, and then as you see, he met his untimely demise, and his pelt also went back to the Smithsonian, where it languished in the archives until 2002, when Candace Wellman, who's a historian from Bellingham, was visiting the Smithsonian, and she asked to see the pelt of Mutton, and she thought from looking at it that she speculated how many blankets at the Smithsonian might also have dog wool in them, so that sparked a whole bunch of scientific research that we'll get into a little bit later. But anyway, cycling back to these dogs, they were fed salmon almost exclusively. Other seafood probably opportunistically, but this goes back to the time when, you know, we actually heard oral stories when I was younger that there were enough salmon coming through this area at the turn of the century that you could almost walk across the backs of them in some of our channels. So thick were the runs. So the abundance of salmon to be feeding hundreds of dogs in a village, really, it was there. A very favorite dog might have house privileges, and these dogs were known to have gotten ceremonial burials. So there's evidence in archaeological digs of the remains of the wool dogs with being wrapped in blankets, things like that. They're roughly medium-sized, long-haired, and they shed naturally twice a year. And so the women would watch for when their hair started coming out in clumps, and then they would use that opportunity to shear them right down to skin, just kind of like a sheep. So this gives you the scope of the idea of the number of dogs a community might have. This is from James McMillan, who's a person in 1826 witnessing from Fort Langley, BC, a flotilla of 160 Cowichan canoes on the Fraser River returning from fall salmon fishing, each canoe with about half a dozen dogs resembling Cheviot lambs shorn of their wool. So at this point, they'd just gone through being clipped, probably at the end of summer. And so they were all short-haired at that time. The math brings this to 960 dogs for that 160 canoes. So you think about the massive number of dogs. So the dog's wool formed the basis of the everyday blankets that our people used. And there's more that goes into proving that there was dog wool, because there were some people that speculated dog wool doesn't spin. So confirming that there was woolly dog blankets at the Smithsonian and the Burke Museum took several methods to proceed with that. Carbon isotope analysis reveals the foods eaten. And again, when they looked at the carbon isotope analysis from blankets that contained woolly dog fur, the basis was marine protein. Well, we know mountain goats don't eat fish, right? And we knew that our woolly dogs ate fish. So there's one example. Scanning electron microscopy also distinguishes the cores of the inner cores of the hair fibers. That was also utilized to compare and distinguish which blanket fibers were from mountain goat wool and which was from dog wool. And then protein mass spectrometry examples the composition of the proteins in fibers, and only tiny amounts were needed. And so that's another sort of preferred, more recent method, because you don't have to disturb as much of the blanket to do the analysis. So on again, your lower right is the pelt of mutton, and in the center is a blanket that was discovered it was investigated that the Burke Museum had for quite a while, and back in 2006, research was done on it using, if I'm remembering right, it was scanning electron microscopy with that Burke Museum blanket, and they were able to confirm that it was almost entirely woolly dog without mountain goat wool in it, and they didn't realize what they had in their possession, that it was not a blend of both. And they also looked at the tear. So you can see the tear up close on the far left. And they identified sinew along with wool as being what was the core of the warp in there. And again, that gave it a great deal of strength. And you can also see how densely packed those fibers are. Like, it's very dense. It almost looks felted. It's that densely woven. So let's flip back a little bit further to the village of Ozette. And so approximately 1560, there was a mudslide out at Ozette, and the village and material objects were not exposed to great extents until the winter storms of 1969 and 70. And when the McCabe people realized how much was actually showing through, they reached out to the Washington State University science program, and they got involved with helping the McCabe tribe with the excavation of over 55,000 items. 23 spindle whorls, that means 7 per house. 14 loom uprights and roller bars, so that was 3 per house. And the main thing that I want to point out to you, and I have a little bit of show and tell that can work for you, is the fragment is laying against some woven cedar bark. And so this looks very dark because it's in ethylene glycol, and that's a preservative so that the oxygen won't further deteriorate the materials in the blanket remnant. But you can also see the stripes that are in it. And so it's got a twill pattern plus a tabby pattern. The tabby pattern is in the stripes, and the twill is in the part that's not striped. And there's a quarter there for context. And I counted 8 wefts, so that's the crossways lengths of yarn for the size of that quarter. And down here, this weaving is a small one that I did, and this is about 8 wefts per quarter, or inch, basically. A quarter, I think, is 7/8 of an inch. I did the measurement just to be sure. So roughly 8 wefts, 8 pieces of yarn per inch. And so that McCabe blanket would have been roughly this fine. As opposed to post-contact, this is more of an image of what people were weaving in the thickness and the density of the yarn, as opposed to how things were done prior to European contact. So it's just one of those influences there. Okay, let's go back over here. So going back to, and this would be right at about the time of contact. This is a pretty famous drawing done by Paul Kane, and in about the 1840s, something like that. And the words in our language, slanget, atsa slangen, is weaving on a tool for weaving, or an upright loom. Women were the spinners and the weavings, and they had to spiritually prepare themselves for weaving by fasting, being celibate, and praying over every step of the process. So part of our teachings for our weavers is that you can only weave when you're in a good place, when you're in a good mind, and that every stitch is a prayer. Every stitch is a prayer. The men built the looms and the spindles and the whorls, but the women were the weavers. They were the spinners, they owned the dog, they produced all of that. And to have enough wealth in your household that the woman had time for doing that, because it was time consuming and laborious, that meant you were a well-to-do household, that you had the time to dedicate to this. The blankets served as warmth, currency, but with my understanding that it's not really like blankets for dollars, a means of exchange currency. Garments, symbols of prestige. High-class families had sufficient resources to amass the numerous blankets necessary for gifting or trade. And what I will point out is that the little dog sitting off to the side there, that is likely a puppy, because the actual wool dogs were expected to be quite a bit larger, more like a medium-sized dog, closer to Spitz, maybe not as big as Samoyeds and Huskies and dogs like that, but definitely larger than the dog that's pictured there. Off in the distance, you can see a woman working with a spindle whorl. And so I've got an example of such a whorl down here. And again, traditionally, pre-contact, the yarn would have been like this. And this was spun on a drop spindle, not this. This is more the wool. I'm going to guess that that's a thicker wool already. But seriously, like the very pre-contact wool was much, much, much finer. And to this day, we tend to favor the thicker wool. It's faster. There's a lot to be said for faster. And this is actually, this is not a permanent residence. This is a summer residence. If you pay attention, those are mats propped up against a frame that's wooden. And those mats are portable. They can be rolled up cattail or rush. You can actually see the braided edges. If you can look at the minutia in that, they've got braided edges on them. So this was likely a seasonal summer camp. And again, that's where we were out fishing and digging clams and all of that. And you still had these ladies who had the ability to do their passion and their work of taking care of their families in terms of creating the blankets. So this was the photograph that went out on the public relations for this event, and I was super excited when Colin shared it with me, because I said, I took a class from one of the descendants of Cilicia. So yes, it's the very top in our language, Cilicia Charlie Isa Sultan. So that means Cilicia Charlie with her spindle whorl. And so Sulsultan means the spindle and the whorl. They come together. We didn't have a word for the spindle and the whorl separately. The Sulsultan was the tool, and the tool was comprised of two parts. And they were typically carved by husbands for their women. And you can see it's flat on one side and concave on the other side. And that concave other side was often decorated with symbols that were spiritually meaningful and significant to the weaver. And the blanket that she is seated upon is mountain goat wool, and what she is spinning is mountain goat wool, and those balls beside her are all mountain goat wool too. She's from the Squamish community. So again, Squamish, if you think about where they're at, from the North Vancouver area, they're right up against Grouse Mountain, and they've got all those beautiful big mountains there. They've got lots of mountain goats. I mean, they're in their backyard, literally. So they had tons of access, and the Squamish people are renowned for the weaving that comes out of that community. And I'll talk more about the revitalization that's taken place up there. But one of the big things for any of you that are spinners here, I think the Coast Salish tend to do something, which is they spin to the left, which is an S spin, and they ply to the right, which is a Z twist. And so that's kind of the opposite about how most people spin commercially nowadays. It's usually Z singles, S plied. And I do have some examples here. So this is considered an example of an S twist because it's got that left pitch on it here, and this is considered a Z pitch because it goes that way. So if people can see that, and it doesn't really make a difference in the actual strength of the garment, but it's just one of the ways in which weavings, when somebody's taking a look at them, they analyze the pitch of the spinning and the plying. And normally, we just did 2-ply. So we didn't tend to get into the fussiness of 3-ply and 4-ply and cabling and all of those things. A few, very, very few historical woven items had some cabling with them, but that's very, very rare. And again, more difficult to do with spindle whorl if you're not working with a spinning wheel or anything like that. She's also seated on a cattail mat. That's another one of my side passions, is bringing cattails back into recognition and acknowledgement. So some of the types of weaving that we did were twill, twine, and tabby. So the twill uses 2 single wefts, uses single wefts, skips 2 or more warps, and it's faster to construct and less sturdy. So that's going to be the all white up there in the corner, and that's an example of twill. The majority of all of the really historic blankets are twill, the really, really old one, including that one from Ozette. It just had a little bits of tabby in the striping. The tabby is just over 1, under 1, over 1, under 1. It's like checkerboard. And it's sturdier than the twilled, less sturdy than the twine, because again, you got those opportunities for the fabric to get hooked, because the warps are exposed in areas. It's the oldest technique, and it's the least common in our collections, because again, a lot of our collections are just blankets back to the 1800s that Ozette find that is, presumably 400 or 500 years old. That's quite a rarity for us in terms of the number of historic blankets that have been able to be examined. Twining has 2 wefts, so every single warp has a weft going around the front and around the back. And so the very colorful one down here on the bottom, you can see that every single one of those warps that are upright has been wrapped. And it is time-consuming but strong, and it really lends itself to elaborate designs. And I will show down here. This is an example, and this is considered sort of a sampler of various different designs of twining. So it's an entirely twined blanket that has, I just love this curve. So it's just kind of, I don't know, for me, it looks like eyes. I've had other people look at those shapes and say they look like fish. And I'm like, well, I'm good with that, because this design right below it is salmon eggs. So that's the name of this design right here. And then these interconnected triangles are replicating the 4 seasons. So starting with fall, winter, spring, and summer. And then this is the river of Tummuth, which is the red paint that is sacred to our people, and it underlies all the mountains. You can find your red paint up in the mountains typically. So I sort of think about all of these as the mountains going through their seasonal changes. And then our cedar trees. So that's just sort of a stylized painting with wool, if you will, twining, of cedar trees. And then right in here is the wave pattern, the Coast Salish wave. And then this last one is just finishing it off with vertical stripes at the base. So that's an example of all the various ways in which designs can be simple, they can be elaborate with twining. And it's my intention that that goes to the museum. So super excited to be sharing that with them. All right. The way in which women worked with looms. So again, you see that's sort of a contemporary style of Coast Salish looms that's freestanding and movable. Traditionally, they were pounded, the posts were pounded right into the ground, and then the bars were wedged into them. So that wedging really serves the purpose of allowing you to adjust tension. So if the tension's a little bit too tight, you can move the wedge out a little bit to loosen it, and if it's loose, you can shove that wedge in and tighten it up. And for anybody that's a weaver, tension is like key. It's really important that you have your tension consistent from how it's warped to how your rows go across, all of that. The reverse warp method, so I sort of started this to give you an idea. This is the reverse warp, and I'm going to undo just a little bit and see if I can talk you through this. So it wraps around top to bottom, and then it goes around a floating bar, goes all the way back down, and wraps around that floating bar and comes back and repeats over and over and over again. So you're always wrapping around the floating bar and coming back. And that's how you get these fringes on the ends. Actually, these fringes have been added, but this gives you an idea of that was on the floating bar. And these right here were just cut at the end of the floating bar. That's a majority of how all our blankets are. And what that floating bar does, once it's warped, these pieces here that are holding it just slide off, and then you can adjust it and roll it up and down so that your ergonomics while you're weaving can be exactly where you need it to be, and you're not hunching your shoulders up or stooping over anything. You can make that item that you're working on float, basically, up and down. The blanket that is displayed in the middle there, and this is the reverse warping technique is very specific to Coast Salish. It's how our work is wrapped on the looms primarily. You don't really see that, like especially if you go up and you look at chilkat weavings, they're only attached at the top. And it's a very different, they're not wrapped the way ours are, they're tied. So, and then they're freestyle. The warps are hanging down long and moving that way. And then the tabletop looms that you see here are an adaptation. The ones that I work with at home are closer to the size that you see off on the other side there. That's considered a standing loom, usually this tall or more, to make a full-size blanket. So hybrid blankets, and a hybrid blanket that I have here as an example is this one. So I'm just going to set the mic down for a second. So again, I guess I'll lay it out like that. I really do like that fluid sort of curvy lines. So that's twining on either end and then all twill in the middle. And then it's got some salmon eggs. This I wove a really long time ago, like I want to say, goodness gracious, maybe 8 years ago. And it's in the school colors for my 14-year-old who goes to school in Anacortes. My tension wasn't really awesome because I've got puckering in here. So I can look at it now with a more critical eye and say, okay, I've improved as a weaver. So again, this was something that happened post-European contact, is that you started seeing really elaborate twining designs on the edges of blankets, and far more of the blankets that were done in the 1800s, especially the 1830s to 1850s, when we still had woolly dogs in our area, to have their wool be incorporated in with this. You started seeing these hybrid designs with the twill on one section of it and then the twining on another. And weavers influenced other weavers, and it's actually considered complementary to someone to emulate their designs, not copy stitch for stitch. That's considered rude. So you can see these two blankets, how similar they are, but to the studied eye, there's differences. There's dark brown triangles in the one, and those don't exist in the other. They're more cream-colored triangle-y shapes, and the greens are a little bit different. But again, they're both really old blankets, and they're both from the mid-1800s. And the other thing that was common at that time is you'd start to see the introduction of commercially spun wool with sheep's wool. And so our women were taking advantage of sheep's wool because it was more prominent. It was more readily accessible. And there was a reason why. Well, I guess I'm fast forwarding to that. So we'll come back to that about why we moved on to sheep's wool, and what happened to the woolly dogs will be a mystery for a few minutes. But first we're going to talk about how, again, this is that example of hybrid blankets where there's great swaths of twill with elaborately twined borders. This is Frank Hilaire and his family from Lummi, Frank also allegedly has a great deal of tie to the Sanish community as well. His wife Agnes and his daughter Amelia are wearing nobility robes, and this is the late 1800s. So they hadn't vanished by this time. They hadn't vanished, and he was one of the most high-class people up at Lummi. So many families, especially if you've heard of Children of the Setting Sun productions with Daryl Hilaire and the whole group, and then they had Children of the Setting Sun dance group and singing group and stuff. Those all come through this Hilaire family line. So very high-class family. You can see the influence of Western dress in a number of the young girls. Those weren't traditional dresses that our people had. They're clearly Western side sewed with material. They're embellished, but they're definitely more European-style clothing with the nobility robes there as well. So again, this is lasting, but it's the period of transition. And so let's talk about the inherent spiritual power of traditional blankets. So to our women and our weavers and our people, part of our teachings are all of these things that we work with have life, have spirit, have energy. And so the blankets themselves, they contain the life force of the animal fiber that they come from. They contain the energy of the loom that they were wrapped around, whether it was cedar or fir, the maple whorl that it was spun on. They contain that energy. And they contain the breath and the sweat and the prayers of the weaver. So all of that goes into these blankets. And we're absolutely, as I've said before, but it bears repeating, our weavers were instructed to never weave when we're angry or sad, so that only good feelings enter that work. And again, I was taught every stitch is a prayer. Every stitch is a prayer. So all of these elements combine to protect and uplift and acknowledge the wearer. And I do want to point out that this is Joseph Waterhouse. He had worked with Samish on restoring a dugout canoe that we built for the paddle to Seattle when that whole project was starting in the 80s. And he's a clallam carver. And our late chairman, Ken Hansen, was working with Tracy Powell, and we had the carving studio was busy making a dugout, and while they were steaming it, it cracked. And we were heartbroken, but Joseph Waterhouse helped us repair that canoe. So he's got a small tie-in with Samish, but that blanket that he's wearing was part of my inspiration for the zigzaggy lines on the sash here, on the one down below, because I loved the look of that blanket. So now, let's talk about what happened to the woolly dogs. What happened? So, along with the introduction of our visitors to this area and the folks that agreed with us that this is a beautiful place to live and it's an abundant place to live. And let's move here, Martha. And so epidemics came to this area, and we were a people that were we had no immunity, no natural immunity to any of the diseases that folks from Europe and other places had developed over time. So we had horrible losses. Like some villages went from 1,000 or 2,000 people to less than 100. So you can think 90% wholesale loss of communities within a few years, basically. So that greatly reduced our ability to food gather. And you think about all those dogs, they need a lot of salmon. We lost 90% of our fishermen. And we lost 90% of the people that would weave and that would take care of the dogs. And so we had to worry about feeding ourselves, much less worry about how we're going to feed the dogs. So that contributed to the fact that we lacked the capacity to sustain those large herds of that wonderful breed. At the very same time, the trading posts that were set up, first down at Nisqually, then at Langley, up on the Fraser River, and shortly after at Victoria, you had these massive sort of headquarters for the Hudson's Bay Company in this area before the pig wars and all of that settled on who owns what. Trade blankets became very, very important in our community. And it was on purpose that I brought Pendleton blankets and a Beaver State blanket here. Because I think it's important that you see that these commercially woven blankets could be had for a couple of beaver pelts. So if our men could get a couple of beavers and get some blankets, my goodness, the amount of effort to go into raising the dogs, acquiring the fish to feed the dogs, let alone the shearing and the spinning and then the weaving and all of that. It didn't take, I'm going to be glib here, a rocket scientist to figure out that there was some economy of scale of setting aside all the time and effort that we had put into something that was so laborious, especially at a time when we lacked the capacity to do so. And then you add in the fact that sheep were being brought into the area because they were meat and they were wool. And they were big and they yielded a lot of wool in comparison to the little wool dogs. So, and they just grazed. Like there wasn't a lot of effort that had to go into raising sheep. If you had a clear space of ground, they'll eat it right down to the nubs if you know sheep. So again, all of these things conspired for the wool dogs to just sort of gradually become depleted. This is a photograph of Ruth Shelton, not Harriet, her daughter. Ruth Shelton with her dog that resembles a wool dog greatly, taking care of the cemetery at Tulalip. And Ruth Shelton was Samish, married into Tulalip. So we like to always claim our relatives wherever we find them. And again, at the bottom is a Hudson's Bay Point blanket. So that's what they looked like at that time. The upper corner, that's actually from your new and improved American Camp Interpretive Center. So that's one of the murals. If you haven't been out there and visited it, I encourage you to go take a peek, because that's just a mural that does a beautiful job of showing what a seasonal camp looked like. So this is a picture of what seasonally that place at American Camp would have looked like, with the reeds and the cattail rush mats out there for temporary shelter and the racks of salmon drying, and then you're imagining all that salmon. And you see some of the wool dogs there depicted as well. So pre-contact, post-contact. So we're going to fast forward to blankets haven't completely vanished in terms of production. As I've said, they were traditionally wrapped around nobility, but by the turn of the century, you could see that type of weaving in coats. So look at the gentleman on the far left there. That's a capot, which is Chinook jargon for coat, but it's clearly woven. You jump forward into the center. Again, there's another gentleman in between two blanketed individuals. He's wearing a fur cap, and that also woven, but it's constructed like a coat. So that was that influence of more contemporary style of garments. And what this chiefly delegation is up across the line, all of the bands were really concerned about their status and their entitlement to treaty rights, particularly where it concerned hunting. And in 1906, the band chiefs from Vancouver Island and British Columbia banded together, and their women who were weavers made sure they were covered in nobility garments, whether it was blankets or the capots, and they went to England to meet with the King of England to negotiate for their treaty rights. Well, it didn't work, but Capilano, who was the chief of the people at Capilano, that we know it now, Capilano, he became even more convinced that he had to lead the charge in fighting for their treaty rights, and he never gave up, his entire life. I don't think he ever lived to see that come to fruition, but for the last 15, 20 years or so, the Canadian government, BC as well, has been engaging in treaty negotiation with the different tribes up there. So it's been taken over 100 years to try and settle things up there in terms of their entitlement to resources on Crown land. So now we're fast forwarding to a point in which Coast Salish weaving goes dormant. And there were a number of reasons why this happened shortly following that whole picture in 1906. So this picture here is about I believe it's 1926. The version I'm looking at here, I can't see my notes. So I'm just pulling it out of my brain. Number one, we had the Great Depression. That happened in 1920, right? For any of you history buffs out there. Shortly following that, the U.S. federal government initiated a forced attempt for all tribes that were organized under the recognition of the U.S. government to form parliamentary-style governments under the Indian Reorganization Act, or the IRA. So that was another thing that got the tribes kind of all in an uproar about how they were going to organize themselves in this way, and at the same time when they were desperately fighting for sustenance in light of, if you think the Depression hit the mainstream community badly on reservations, it was even worse. And then there was the mainstream public perception that all tribes wore plain style regalia. So this is Ruth Shelton, again, that high class lady who descends from Seaholm, Chief Seaholm, who is a Clallam chief. She descends from him, that's her father, in fact, or grandfather. Her mother was Julia. But Ruth is wearing fairly traditional, I would say, contemporary outfit. She's got on kind of a gingham check dress and a plaid shawl and sort of an embroidered bag. That's a grandson, William, I believe that's Wayne Williams, standing next to her. And then her husband was the chief. And Harriet Shelton Dover is on the far left, and that's a cousin that's in between them. And without my notes, I don't have his name. I believe it's Silas George, but I'm not 100% certain of that. They're all wearing Plains regalia, basically. And that was how you got public recognition, as like if you were not wearing Plains regalia during that time period, you were not considered native. So our people sort of adapted to that public perception, and again, our traditional garments would not have been acknowledged by the mainstream public. So it was kind of that set aside. So then, lo and behold, in the 60s, up in the Chilliwack area of British Columbia, a local landowner named Oliver Wells, he worked with, first of all, Adeline Lorenzetto, and they took apart a historic blanket that it wasn't in a museum collection, it was privately owned in a family, held on to. They took it apart to examine how was it constructed. And they didn't take the whole thing apart, but they took apart enough of it that they could do that research. And then he had seen images of historic looms, so they cobbled together some kind of a loom, and she started working on it. And then Mary Peters got word, well, she had a historic loom, and her mother and grandmother had been weavers, so she hadn't forgotten what to do. So between Mary Peters and Adeline Lorenzetto working with Oliver Wells, they started recreating these Coast Salish weavings, and they actually got so well known because Oliver Wells wrote a book about Coast Salish weaving, primitive and modern, and this was in the 60s, and then he started writing articles and submitting them to publications, and they got published. And so they got some notoriety. They actually were contacted by the brand new Hotel Bonaventure in Montreal and got commissioned to do wall hangings for them. And so that got the other ladies in the Chilliwack area, they're known as the Stallo people. They were brought in to help spin the wool, because this was going to be a big production. They needed spinners, and they needed people to help with the dyeing, because it was going to be elaborate, and they wanted traditional dyeing as much as possible and not the aniline dyes that are commercially available. So all of these women got super excited about recreating this technology in their community, and in 1971 they formed the Salish Weavers Guild. And they actually ended up with like a small cottage industry where they would have some of the women would specialize in the wool production. Oliver Wells was himself had a few sheep, but he knew how to reach out to the local farmers and get wool for them. The women would process the wool, and then they would spin it, and then they had other women that specialized in dyeing it after it was spun, and then they had certain women that just really loved to weave. So these are examples of some of the weavings that came out of this time period. And I know that my parents belonged to a recreational club. My dad was an avid skeet shooter, and they were called the Pacific Northwest Indians Skeet Shooting Club. He was one of the only Indians in the club. But anyways, they would offer acknowledgement gifts of these weavings to the winners and stuff. So my mom had several of these Salish Weavers Guild wall hangings and stuff when I was growing up. The Musqueam people, who live in what you would think of as the south side of the Fraser River on the coast. So I think that's Simon Fraser territory for the university and whatnot. UBC, I think, is up there too. Anyways, the Musqueam people had their own revival just very shortly after, I would say, put that at about the mid-70s to the early 80s when they really got a whole bunch of ladies going. And again, Barb Marks McCoy that I was telling you about, that's the great-grandmother of my niece, she was part of that Musqueam revival, and that's where she replicated one of the museum blankets. So hot off the loom weavings, I chose these images because I think they depict the strength of the weaving and the amount of prayer that goes into the weaving and the satisfaction. So that is the late Bill James. He's at a weavers conference, and he's proudly showing off his regalia there that he wove. Bill, just a masterful weaver right up till the very end. That is Robin Sparrow in the center. She again was part of that Musqueam revival. And so you see the double width shawl that she's got there. And that's just an incredibly beautiful wall hanging that she made. And then the Seahawks colored ones are going for spiritual work that's happening in the winter to acknowledge somebody who's passed on who was an absolute avid Seahawk fan. So it's honoring, the interests and the intent of that individual, and again, prayer in every stitch. So I can't skip over the fact that there were some men weavers. As I spoke about Bill James, Silly, he was a hereditary chief up at Lummi. He just passed away a few years ago. And he influenced many, many weavers in this area. He along with his mom, Fran James. Fran was the spinner and Bill was the weaver. And he actually, he did his research at the American Indian Art Institute in New Mexico in the late 60s, early 70s around revitalization of Coast Salish weaving. So he studied and he practiced and he studied and he practiced, and he was a big part of bringing that back to life in the last few decades. On the other side of the trio is still with us, Willard, or Buddy, as most of us know him, Joseph Skletz-Emeltuch. He's from Squamish, and he and his wife, Janice George, I'm going to talk more about their more recent influence in Coast Salish weaving. They both apprenticed with Subier, Bruce Miller, who's passed on in 2005 from Skokomish. And, I searched the internet for images of Bruce Miller with his weaving. Couldn't find him. He's mostly known as a basket weaver, but he was very, very influential in Coast Salish weaving, as we talk about another one of his students that's had a profound impact on that. So I just have to name people that have had amazing influences as weavers. And so these are other weavers who are considered master weavers. So on the lower little quadrant there is Frida George. She's Stalo, and one of those weavings that I showed you from the Chilliwack Salish Weavers Guild was done by her mother, Margaret Jimmy. So Frida is really well known for doing realistic designs. So you can see that image behind her is one of her wall hangings, where you've got like the free-flowing river, and you can see the mountains and the trees themselves, canoes, those little designs that look like rectangles with little triangles connected. That's called the flying goose. So flying geese stacked like that. That's her style. That's very, very notable, I would say. It stands out, and you can almost look at something and say, oh, Frida George wove that. Above her is Deborah Sparrow, again, super accomplished weaver. She was the one that was wearing the double width blanket. Deborah's had such a passion. She was part of that Musqueam revival. She's had such a passion for Coast Salish weaving that she challenged the city of Vancouver to help her blanket the city. And so she worked with her other friends up in the lower mainland of BC to come up with design work based on their actual blankets and work with the city to wrap pillars and huge posts and walls with that image of the weavings. And so far, she like to literally wrap the city of Vancouver in the image of blankets. And she's been very successful with that. So I encourage you to go Google that and look up Wrap the City of Vancouver in Blankets, because the outcome of that project has just been astounding. And many, many of her work is visible in museum. The Royal BC Museum over in Victoria has the entire, I want to say it's like, I'm not going to misspeak. I think it's Hulkaminum, which is what those people speak. I don't know, I could be wrong. But the alphabet, she wove the alphabet in this giant four-sided rectangular cube. So it's amazing, it's worth seeing. And then Rita Lewis, who is Paquachin and Samish, she was my teacher. So I have to always give her credit, and she again was part of that Musqueam revival. So these are teachers, people who are master weavers to this day, who were taught by some of those revival weavers. So Angela George of Squamish, she's holding up one of the blankets that's very similar to the one on the loom behind her. You have, and she's on the far left. On the other side is Danielle Morset, and I'm going to have more to say about Danielle, but she actually graphs out all of her work. So she digitally graphs her work, and then she weaves it. So she's that thoughtful about how she approaches her work, and the precision with which Danielle weaves is just outstanding. I can't say enough about her as a weaver. She studied under Bill James. She studied under the late Virginia Adams from Suquamish. She's had many, many teachers that she's worked with over the years. The late Subier, Bruce Miller, was also an influence for Danielle. So she's remarkable and has been commissioned to do incredible work. She just had a showing in England of some of her work. So very, very outstanding. And then in the center is Janice George Chapemiath and Buddy Joseph, and without the text, I can't say his Indian name. So anyways, they were blanketing one of their young relatives for an honorary ceremony. So they studied together, those two as a couple. They apprenticed with the late Bruce Miller from Skokomish. They're from Squamish, North Vancouver. They moved down to Skokomish by Shelton, and they lived with him for 6 months and did nothing but weave. And since then, they've taught over 2,000 people in their community how to weave. So powerful, powerful influence of these folks. So again, I want to just acknowledge Danielle Morset a little bit more, and I'm kicking myself because I haven't actually shown her actual blankets, which are just remarkable. But what she's holding is an 8th generation blanket. So if any of you have not heard of 8th generation, Louis Gong, who is Nooksack, started this company. It's indigenous owned, it's indigenous designs, it's not copied from native, which is Pendleton. And actually, it's been bought recently by the Snoqualmie tribe, and Louis is still very active in the leadership of the board of 8th Generation and the Vision, and they are now using U.S. sourced wool for their blankets, and they're the only native blanket company that exists that's using U.S. sourced wool that doesn't come. It's reducing the carbon footprint of where does the wool come from, and they're producing them right here in Washington State. So yay, 8th Generation. So Danielle, that's a design of a blanket that she wove. So she did this blanket in Coast Salish weaving style, and then 8th Generation interpreted it in one of their commercial blankets, and they're exclusively available through the gift shops at Suquamish. So whether it's through their museum or their Clearwater Resort, that's where you can find those. Janice George and Buddy Joseph co-authored Salish blankets, robes of protection and transformation, symbols of wealth. And this book came out, I think, in 2016 or 2017. Anyways, it's an amazing book. And to me, I consider it my Bible, really, in Coast Salish weaving. I used to really like the Paula Gustafson, but here's the thing, and I will say, fun fact, I got this at a used book sale in Friday Harbor, about 20 years ago. And so don't forget your used bookstores if you're looking for anything like this, because I think it's out of print now anyways. And she's got colors, insets in there that are just absolutely fabulous to look at the detail of these museum blankets. But she's the one that came up with the idea that poo-pooed dog's wool can't be woven, can't be spun. And I'm so sad because I looked for it. I've got a small ball of dog hair yarn, and do you think I could find it to bring here for my show and tell? I could not find it, but anyways, Buddy and Janice, again, they're just amazing. And then I also have to acknowledge Susan Pavel, who's Filipina, but she's married into Skokomish, and she was gifted a Skokomish traditional name by her husband's uncle, the late Bruce Miller. Because she was married right into that family and just part of that whole community, she learned weaving from her husband's late uncle, and he saw right away she had something amazing. And so this wall hanging here, it hangs in Portland. I believe that's where it lives. It was commissioned for work in Portland. It's about 20 feet tall. You can't see it here, without context of her standing next to it. And it's a work in progress. I'm showing all the little bits and pieces of when you finish an edge, you've got to go back in and tuck every single one of those little loose ends and stuff. And so that's the fiddly work with weaving that, it actually, I'm one of those people that I gotta get in there and get all the tucking done before I move on to the next section. Like my brain can't handle it to see them dangling. So I wanna get in there and fuss with that right now, just looking at it. And truly, I know some weavers that they might be sisters. One sister does the weaving, the other sister does all the finish work, because that's the only thing she really loves to do. She doesn't want to sit there at the loom every day and stuff, but oh my gosh, give her like a big-eyed needle or a crochet hook or something, and she'll just go to town and get it in there. And she says it's like flossing teeth. So, yeah. So Susan is looking at one of the very historic blankets there in one of the collections, and I can't say off the top of my head whether this was Chicago Field Museum or if this was someplace else, but she has created this Coast Salish Wool Weaving Center, and it's a nonprofit, and it's bringing together all of the most renowned weavers from this area. So again, Buddy and Janice are part of that group. Gail White Eagle from Muckleshoot is part of that group. A whole host of people are part of that, and they are committed to doing what they can to promote and revitalize the tradition. So here's just a few snippets of revival weaving at Samish. I started a class, maybe 2018, something like that. And then, a couple years later, we had a pesky little pandemic. So there was one of our elders working on a project in 2018, and then we had a pandemic, and Samish really took it seriously. So they closed the doors for 4 years. We just opened up this last spring. We were not open until 2023 in the spring that we started opening it back up again and stuff. And Jan and I were both retired. She had some health issues that kind of prevented her from getting back to sitting at the loom for long periods of time. And I knocked on a few doors and said, hey, who do I have to pay to come in here and sit down at the loom every day and work on this for her? So I was able to get together with I'll just back it up here, Emily was bound determined she wanted to finish her blanket too. So we got staff to let us in and let us work on these things that were in one of the cultural centers that the tribe has, and we've made headway, and that was Jan being blanketed in her shawl last weekend. So that was pretty excited. She was just absolutely, she wouldn't let it go for the rest of the day. That's how she sat. So ceremonial uses of blankets for weddings. In the center, Andrea Wilbur Seago, and that's the graduation blanket she wove for her daughter. That's Fran Nahaney wearing a blanket that she wove for her own naming. That's Ray and Noel Natrero wearing a wedding blanket that they commissioned. And get this, the person that wove that blanket, when she brought it to Ray, he had not seen it. He was the one that asked, his friend, relative, whatever, to weave this blanket. The story's in Salish Blankets, the Buddy and Janice book. So if you want to know more, you can read about it in there. But the Cliff Notes version is, he had a dream about the blanket, and when she brought it to him, he wept, because that's what he dreamt. That's what he dreamt. And he hadn't told her anything at all about what to weave. He just said, weave us a blanket. So again, the prayers that go into them. So if you think back to those pictures of long ago, and even the one with Joe Waterhouse, the blankets were wrapped around the men. In more modern times, you're starting to see, and the first instance of this being depicted in photograph wasn't until the 1940s, of a blanket that was being worn across one shoulder of a native gentleman over by Pat Bay, when the airport was being built for Victoria. So that was the first instance of us actually having documentation of a man wearing a blanket just over one shoulder. And now it's just almost the only thing that they do. And in fact, we purposely weave narrow blankets so they don't have to be folded up, so that they can just be draped across. It's typically the left shoulder, so it covers the heart. Although you're seeing the dad there is wearing his blanket over the right shoulder. I put it on him. I wasn't thinking. And then you've got Bill James wearing his blanket next to Buddy Joseph, who's wrapped, and then Bill James wrapped in a blanket as well. So there's no right or wrong. There's not a lot of variation. It can be done, but we're just sort of slowly seeing a shift to more over one shoulder. I also have to say that Susan Pavel, who is wearing the red with the white and black tunic, and she's got a little youngster on her lap. She's sitting right next to Fran James, who's in a wearing a headdress with a headband with sunglasses, and then her son, Bill James, next to her. The blanket that they are wearing, they have draped across their laps for the purpose of the photograph. This was taken in 2006. Her husband, Michael, who's also got a little youngster on his lap and longer hair, seated with a tunic on. He spent 12 years gathering mountain goat wool. 12 years. It took her a very long time to spin all that wool and 6 months of weaving to weave that blanket. It weighed 15 pounds. And they gathered together the royalty of Coast Salish weavers in all our communities. And Buddy and Janice are right behind Susan in cedar hats. So every person there got a chance to wear the blanket at this ceremony at Evergreen College. And some of the elders actually had to be seated because it was too heavy for them to wear. And so they basically danced the blanket in ceremony around their first time. An entire 100% mountain goat wool blanket has been done probably in over a century. So again, powerful, powerful experience for all these people. And our late chairwoman, Margaret Green, up in the far corner there. So this, a little image of this is actually a vest that's at the Karshner Center down in Puyallup now, is where it resides. I wove that as a vest. I thought of putting up the image of it still on the loom because I've always had trouble with like sizing things. I thought it would fit me. It probably fits a 5-year-old. So it went to the museum. But anyways, my resources for you, and I've got all but the Oliver Wells book up front, is the book on Salish weaving by Paula Gustafson, Hands of Our Ancestors, the Revival of Salish Weaving at Musqueam, Salish Blankets, Robes of Protection, Transformation, and Symbols of Wealth, and then Salish Weaving, Primitive and Modern, only available in used books, if you could find it for sale, out of print for a long time. So I know y'all have been sitting here for a really long time patiently. If there's any questions that I can answer for people, or if you just want to come chat and touch. Oh, I will say, I didn't note it on the slide, but I also wanted to say, when weaving went dormant, we picked up knitting. So the Cowichan style knitting materials, quarter bags of Cowichan style became really, really commonplace. And in fact, Barb Marks McCoy, who did that amazing elaborate weaving, she now spends almost all of her time exclusively knitting. Like, she finds it more enjoyable, and she says it's faster, it's more portable, she can take it with her to appointments and things like that. You're not stuck sitting at a loom all the time. And I did want to highlight the late Bill James wove this, and so I was at a weavers conference at Suquamish probably about 8 years ago, and he had a bunch of things out there for sale, and I just said, "That's fascinating. I love that design." And he kind of went into detail explaining to me how he did it, and it did help me with the mechanics of how to do that, because I don't know that I'd been able to figure it out on my own. And I've got, one other thing that I will say, with all of our potlatching, women, when blankets were gifted at potlatches, they were commonly cut into strips. And so the women would take the yarn and repurpose it back into something. And so this is actual wool that there was a piece that I made that I wasn't happy with the final piece, and so I'm going to do something else with it. But I wanted to show you an example of nothing happens to the wool. You can rework it, and oftentimes we're working with short pieces, like maybe arm's length or something, and then we figure out how to finger spin to add on. And I will say, just for anybody that's interested in anything Chilkat, this is just some thigh spun yarn that does have the cedar, the yellow cedar added to it. So it's Chilkat style. It's not anything at all that we did. But a lot of times people are really interested in the differences between Coast Salish and the Raven's Tail or Chilkat style weaving. So there's an example of this would be warp that would have hang down to be those fabulous aprons and shawls and things like that they make. And a shawl out of big, thick, chunky yarn. So. All right.